Hi there, Victor Pross speaking to you, anarchist artist. Okay, today we are going to talk about Ayn Rand, particularly Rand's conception of government. And as the title of the video is called, The Cult of Ayn Rand's Government, sounds very derogatory. I hasten to add, however, that I do have a great deal of respect for Ayn Rand. I am very tired of the libertarian and the anarchists who dismiss her out of hand. That is completely unjust and not called for, and they're depriving themselves of a great deal of amount of intellectual nourishment in denying themselves the opportunity to read Ayn Rand, whether it be her fiction books or her non-fiction books. Her fiction books, Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, the latter being my favorite, are pivotal works of art, and her non-fiction books such as the Capitalism, The Unknown Ideal, Philosophy Who Needs It, and The Virtue of Selfishness, etc., are extraordinary books that have offered a lot in terms of understanding the free market, of understanding the sovereign individual, in terms of understanding non-aggressive ethics and the freedom of the mind, and a philosophy that is very profound in many senses, and of which she has been a great innovator and has offered a lot. So it's very unfortunate, I think, very unfortunate that modern libertarians don't acknowledge their debt to Rand. And but even though I am going to make a critique of Rand's government here, my critique of her is rather confined and limited to her position where government is concerned, and I am not the one to dismiss her as a knee-jerk reaction across the board, as a categorical rejection. It's a grave injustice to her, I think. But anyway, the critique, though, of course, is that when you take Rand as a ethical philosopher and Rand as a political philosopher, there is a clash. This is not a critique that's unique to me, but I'm going to flesh it out in this video, and to show, to prove, to demonstrate, to back up why Rand, the ethicist, clashes with Rand, the political philosopher. Her position on ethics is at loggerheads when it comes to any conception of government, including Rand's approach to government, which is very unique from other conceptions. But so now, if we examine Rand, first of all, having a good understanding of her ethical position in terms of individual rights and non-aggression, it's a very dense work that she offers, of course. But we're just going to take a couple of quotes and to set the foundation of this talk. But even though her ethical philosophy is rather profound, we're just going to go in gently and just take relevant, significant parts for the purposes of this talk. But I encourage you to read The Objectivist Ethics in full, which can be found in The Virtue of Selfishness. Now, to quote Rand, we're going to let's examine this quote of Rand, the ethicist, and the ethical philosopher that we see here before us, and contrast that to her conception of government, which we'll get to here. Let's just to quote this. Now, the basic political principle of the objectivist ethics is, no man may initiate the use of physical force against others. No man, or group, or society, or government has the right to assume the role of a criminal and initiate the use of physical compulsion against any man. Men have the right to use physical force only in retaliation and only against those who initiate its use. The ethical principle involved is simple and clear-cut. It's the difference between murder and self-defense. Man's rights can be violated only by the use of physical force. And let me just pause here to say that that's a very key sentence. Keep that in mind as we move along. I'm going to repeat it. Man's rights can be violated only by the use of physical force. It is only by the means of physical force that one man can deprive another of his life, or enslave him, or rob him, or prevent him from pursuing his own goals, or compel him to act against his own rational judgment. The precondition of civilized society is the barring of physical force from social relationships, thus establishing the principle that if men wish to deal with one another, they may do so only by means of reason, by discussion, persuasion, and voluntary, uncoerced agreement. Unquote. So, if we just take those paragraphs from a large volume of writings in ethics that she's offered, if we take that and we contrast that to her conception of government, which we're going to do, we'll see very clearly, I think I'm going to demonstrate in this video, why there is a fundamental clash. Rand's moral principles, I contend, if consistently applied, lead necessarily to a repudiation of government. Now, let me give you a nutshell conception of Rand's government. Ayn Rand's political philosophy falls generally into the tradition of classical liberalism. In a proper society, the government is the servant of the citizens, not their ruler. And specifically, it is the agent of self-defense. So in short, a government's only proper function is to protect individual rights, and that's it. Okay, this is the Randian form of government. Now, for Rand, a government's essential functions are brought down to three primary functions, and only three primary functions. The police, to protect men from criminals; the armed services, to protect men from foreign invaders; and the law courts, to settle disputes among men according to objective laws. Now, Rand makes it clear that government is naked force. So, gotta make that clear. Gotta make that clear. She understands that. Government is force. It's inherently negative. The power of force is the power of destruction, not of creation. And so it must be used accordingly to destroy destruction. So, to destroy destruction is some of the objectivists would say, which means, of course, is that for those private citizens that would initiate force against you by trying to kill you, assault you, rape you, murder you, the government's function is to destroy that attempt at destruction. The government is only to act as the protector of individual rights. Given this, the state is only to use its monopoly on force in retaliation for the protection of individual rights and must never be the initiator of force. This is Rand's whole approach to government, and we can see how that differs greatly from other statists, garden variety statists, where, as far as they're concerned, the government is to have its bloody sticky fingers in all types of pots, from preventing the free association of people, to the military draft, to victimless crimes, from preventing 90-year-old guys feeding the homeless people, and all of that shit. Rand's position is separate and quite distinct from the other forms of statism. Now, any additional functions would have to involve the government initiating force against innocent citizens. The state must not undertake to provide its citizens with economic standards or benefits, whether in regards to goods or services or conditions of trade. Politicians, therefore, must have nothing to do with production or distribution. That is, they may not build, manage, or regulate schools, hospitals, utilities, roads, parks, post offices, railroads, steel mills, banks, etc., etc., etc. Nor may they hand out subsidies, franchises, terror protection, social insurance, minimum living standards, or minimum wage laws for workers, etc., etc., etc. A limited, rights-respecting government would have no welfare system and no forced pension-paying system like Social Security. It would not have agencies with open-ended and vaguely defined regulatory powers. Again, a proper government, in Rand's view, offers freedom from coercion, including indirect force, which is fraud. and not from the responsibility of self-sustenance. So make no mistake about this. Okay, let's give Rand her due where she stands on this, and we'll get to the critique soon. Rand was very explicitly against the initiation of physical force. If we consider Rand the ethicist, okay, she was very much against the initiation of physical force, or the threat of force, as a fundamental social principle that even governments are forbidden to violate. Now, to the extent that a government initiates force against innocent people, it violates the very rights that it is said that they are to protect. And she understood that. The government is a gun. Now, Ayn Rand was once asked during an interview, "Miss Rand, what is a government?" And she raised her fist and she said, "It's this. It's force." So she understood that. The power of government is the power of the gun. It has the power to enforce a set of rules in a territory. It controls a power that has often turned against freedom. And she was a great critic against government as initiator of force and a violator of rights. Hell, probably 60% of her political writings focused on this complaint. Very stalwart critic against government force, but nevertheless, though, I still contend, of course, that there is a major fundamental contradiction between Rand the ethicist and Rand the political philosopher, and we are going to get to that very soon. Now, Ayn Rand opposed coercive taxation on principle because taxation necessarily involves the initiation of force by government. So she realized that. She understood that. And she proposed some possible alternatives that would enable a government to finance itself by voluntary means. However, I mean, if you can imagine, this whole idea of voluntary taxation. Can you imagine if the defenders of either side in the ratification debate, for example, the anti-federalists or federalists themselves, had encountered Rand's argument for voluntary taxation or voluntary contributions to the government? They would have attacked it as a contradiction in terms, but even more crucial, as a rejection of the very idea of a sovereign government altogether. Voluntary taxation, they would have attacked it as being against the whole idea of a sovereign government altogether. And in this case, this theoretically legitimate government has never existed anywhere on earth, nor can it exist anywhere except in what Edmund Burke called the fairyland of philosophy. And as Joshua Tucker put it, the consent theory of government is the universal demolisher of all governments, but not the builder of any. So this consent theory it goes hand in hand with the whole idea of voluntary taxation or voluntary contributions to the government. It relies on a consent theory of government. And Joshua Tucker has rightly identified it, that this whole idea of consent theory is the universal demolisher of all governments, not the builder of any. Every defender of government has recognized coercive taxation to be an essential component of state sovereignty, a power without which no government can exist. So really the principle of quote-unquote voluntary taxation reduces Rand's so-called government to a free market protection agency. It becomes a business on the free market that must satisfy its customers or lose its customer base or even go out of business. Now, even the most minimal night watchman state funded by voluntary donations would still be coercive. At the very least, it would have to prohibit any competing protection services. Otherwise, it would risk being competed out of existence. If the initiation of force is not a part of the equation, it's not a government. This is what has to be understood, okay? If the initiation of force is not a part of the equation, it's not a government. a minarchist state, that proverbial night watchman state that enforced only negative rights in the course of protecting life and liberty and property, would cost so little that it could be funded by the investment income from a trust, let's say, and would thus require no taxes. We can entertain that thought for a little while. However, the reason such a minimal state does not exist and could never exist is because the act of vesting one organization with such supreme and ultimate power causes the very worst people in society to gravitate towards that organization like flies to shit, and will eventually co-opt and exploit the rest of society. And consider that to be the short version of U.S. history. Even the most minimal watchman state, funded by voluntary donations, would still be coercive, because at the very least it would have to prohibit any competing protection agencies. And I stress, if the initiation of force is not a part of the equation, it's not a government. Okay, it's another social institution altogether. For a government to hold its monopoly, it must initiate violent force. What is to prevent a dissatisfied customer in full possession of his individual rights from withholding his money, his voluntary contributions, from a Randian government, while subscribing instead to the services of another agency? What's to stop him? The state is vested with the exclusive power to adjudicate legal disputes and enforce laws, while forcibly preventing other individuals and associations from engaging in the same activities. The state, in other words, exercises a coercive monopoly in the enforcement of justice, and the state therefore is a perpetual rights violator, a massive institution of injustice because of it. So let's continue to stress the crucial importance upon definitions. I was very clear in stressing the importance of definitions in my video, What is Anarchism?, which I invite you to listen to. And we have to ask, what is the essential fundamental characteristic that separates government from any other social institution? This is key. What is the essential fundamental characteristic that separates government from any other social institution? What attribute or distinguishing characteristic unites all governments under a common definition? And of course, there are many types of governments. The term government subsumes theocracy, absolute monarchy, Nazism, fascism, democratic socialism, and any other number of sundry dictatorships. As I said, it is said that the purpose, as being argued by the Randians, that the purpose of government is to protect individual rights. But that's hardly a definition of government. It's not a definition of government. Fascism and socialist regimes are also governments, but they hardly can be said to be institutions that protect individual rights. So let's get to a generic definition of government that subsumes all governments, including Rand's government. A government is an institution that holds the exclusive power to enforce certain rules of social conduct in a given geographical area. Now, to hold exclusive power, the state must initiate force against people, thus violating individual rights and the non-aggression principle. Pardon me if I speak with a great deal of emotion on this subject matter, but it's very important that the objectivists and people who are sitting on the fence, or other minarchist sorts, understand this. They have to understand this. Government is force. It's initiatory force. This is not a controversial statement. Ayn Rand, the arch advocate of a constitutional republic, will inform you that government is force. Barack Obama will tell you that government is force. George Washington will tell you that government is force. Okay, now, just to make this point clear, I think this will illustrate it. Okay, in understanding the nature of the beast that we're dealing with here when it comes to government and politicians and the military and the citizens. You know, let's really get down to the nitty-gritty empirical core here. The government is a very broad abstraction, right? So, as such, we all tend to have the mental habit of thinking of the state as if it were some powerful entity that looks over a mass of mere mortal individuals. We tend to think of Thomas Hobbes' mighty Leviathan, the state. But the so-called government is just made up of people. I know a lot of people might be, oh, really? Well, that's really profound. The government is made up of people. Yeah, but do you really understand the implications of that, though? Now let's try to just concretize and make this very, very clear. Okay, the significance of understanding that the government is just made up of people. In the book City of God, St. Augustine relates the story of a notorious pirate. The pirate plundered small boats and raided villages along the coastline, and he was eventually captured and brought to the mighty Emperor Alexander the Great. And the emperor angrily demanded of the pirate, "How dare you molest the seas?" To which the cheeky, sarcastic pirate replied with unabashed insolence, "How dare you molest the whole world? Because I do it with a small boat, I'm called a pirate and a thief. You, with a great navy, molest the world and are called an emperor." So, we can ask, what is the real difference between a pirate and an emperor, apart from the scale of action? Both the pirate and the emperor use coercion and violence to accomplish their goals. Both men expropriated the property of other people. What is the real difference between a pirate and an emperor? And we can ask the very same question in modern times in contrasting the political elite to private criminals. The moral of the story remains the same. It remains the same. Now, a lot of anarchists will and have, from Kinsella to Murray Rothbard to Stefan Molyneux to Michael Shanklin to Jeffrey Tucker to Walter Block, etc., 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 have pounded the drumbeat over and over again to make it clear that, as I've been doing in this video so far, and as I've done in the past, to make it absolutely clear that the government is the institutionalization of initiatory violence. I mean, that has been driven home time and time and time and time and time again and again, ad nauseum. But there's something else that I want to offer you, dear listener of mine. There's something else that I have to make very clear in understanding the nature of this beast. There's another crucial aspect that has not been given a great deal of focus upon in understanding and distinguishing the government. Yes, of course, it's an institution of initiatory violence. Yes, that is absolutely fundamentally key in distinguishing this institution. But I would also offer this in understanding a distinguishing characteristic. Government is the institutional embodiment of a moral argument. Okay, hold it. Stay with me. Stay with me. Please stay with me. A government is the institutional embodiment of a moral argument, and its legitimacy is contingent on the validity of that argument. Politics rests on ethics, a certain theory of ethics. Political power, unlike sheer physical power, is an alleged right of making laws for the public good. Now, this moral right is what distinguishes a government from a criminal gang. This is what's asserted. Of course, it's bullshit. All I'm saying is that it is a normative institution. False is all bloody hell. False is all bloody hell as a legitimate institution. But it is a normative institution. Excuse me. Now, this moral right is what distinguishes a government from a criminal gang. There are two main normative features of the state. Number one, The claim to use legitimate coercion. A criminal hold-up man does not make any claims to legitimacy. He just wants you to hand over your fucking wallet, or else. So, number one, the claim to use legitimate coercion. Number two, the state claims to be the final arbiter in matters involving coercion. So they not only claim a moral legitimacy over force, they also claim a monopoly over that legitimate use. Okay, so there you go. That's another dimension to understanding this institution, and not just, initiatory violence. Okay, a criminal on the street initiates violence, right? You could have a gang of criminals on the street initiating violence. Okay, it doesn't make them a government. It's only one aspect of the crucial distinguishing characteristic. Okay, it's all, the state is a normative institution. Now to wrap up, when the 19th century minarchist Auberon Herbert advanced his theory of voluntary taxation, that's right, Rand wasn't the first, he was widely praised by anarchists such as Benjamin Tucker, who embraced him as one of their own. But he was assailed by fellow minarchists such as Herbert Spencer, who correctly pointed out that Herbert's position was indistinguishable from anarchism. So, it's no accident that the gateway drug to a growing anarchist movement did not only spring from the influence of Ron Paul, but also from the writings of Ayn Rand. This is Victor Pross, anarchist artist, signing out. Pop goes the culture.